Hello, everybody. My name is Johns Hopkins, and I'm with the nonprofit organization Baltimore Heritage, and I'm thrilled to be here today to help celebrate the 100th birthday of another nonprofit organization in Baltimore, the Associated Jewish Federation of Baltimore. For those of you who haven't heard of the Associated before, it's a charity. It raises money for good causes, and if you're thinking, well, good causes sound pretty broad, over the last 100 years, it's raised money for things like housing and food, for clothing, for children, for anti-Semitism efforts around the world. So a pretty broad organization. I'm even more thrilled to be here because I'm joined by Beth Goldsmith, who's chair of the Associated's board, and we're going to hear from her in just a minute or two. But let me say a few words before we jump in. One is we're here on Mount Royal Avenue, and behind me is the Associated's office, so that makes sense to start this series. And we're going to do 5 of these videos exploring Jewish heritage in Baltimore and the impact of the Associated over the last 100 years. So it makes sense to start here, but it also makes sense to start here because across the street is the Lyric Opera House. And that's where 100 years ago, the Associated had its first fundraising dinner, which we'll hear about also. All right, I want to start by just mentioning briefly some of the roots of giving in the Jewish faith. And they, at least in part, can be traced back to 2 concepts. One is called tzedakah, and I'm sorry if I'm butchering that a little bit. The other is called tikkun olam. Tzedakah really means charitable giving in essence, but it also has connotations in righteous giving as well as justice. It's really recognizing a concept that giving is maybe not an obligation, but that we're part of a larger community and we should be giving back. Tikkun olam, is what's said at the end of many Jewish services, and that means sort of go and perfect the world, an acknowledgement that we're living in an imperfect world, and it is all of our obligation to help make it a better place. Final thing I just want to note is in the Torah it says, "There will never cease to be needy ones in your land." And I think the Associated, certainly over the last 100 years, has recognized that from the very beginning and probably forever, there will always be a need for charity. All right, before handing it over to Beth, just want to mention a few of the earliest charitable efforts in Baltimore's Jewish communities. And there really were sort of 2 groups of Jewish folks here back in the early 1800s, middle 1800s. Those who traced their ancestry to Germany and those who traced their ancestry to Eastern Europe. And let's start with the German folks first. They started arriving in the late 1700s, early 1800s. So really some of Baltimore's first earliest citizens. There was a big wave of immigrants in the 1850s, and that's when formal charitable organizations really got going. One of the first in 1856 was a group called the Hebrew Ladies Sewing Society. They donated clothes and bedding for folks in need. In one banner year, they donated almost 4,000 pieces of clothing and 1,000 sheets and pillowcases. So really phenomenal effort there. In 1876, a group started the Hebrew Orphan Asylum in West Baltimore. We've done a whole video on that if you want to learn more. But that was not just a place for kids who didn't have parents, but really a place to educate and train the next generation of leaders in Baltimore. In 1898, so getting up close to 1900, the Council Milk and Ice Fund, kind of an interesting name, it got started because, as it said, there were great numbers of sick and ill-fed babies. In 1921, for example, it delivered 42,746 quarts of milk. It not only had a broad reach, it kept very exact records, apparently. And then in 1922, there was a group that started the Jewish Country Home in Catonsville as a respite for women and kids at first, and then families a little bit later on, to basically get a break from the hardscrabble urban life of Baltimore at the time. Okay, on the Eastern European side of things, the Eastern European folks started arriving really in the 1870s, and they immediately started forming charitable organizations also. The Free Loan Association in 1888 started with a group of folks pooling money together. They raised $64 So clearly not folks of great means, but folks of great hearts. They eventually were able to offer loans of $5 to $50 for people who were really in need. The Hebrew Friendly Inn in 1890 helped immigrants who were just arriving and literally had no place to stay. The Children's Protective and Sheltering Home in 1900, again for kids who needed help, eventually merged with the Hebrew Orphan Asylum. And then finally, the Immigrant Protective Association in 1900. In its first year, it helped 600 people arrive in this new land. All right, before turning it over to Beth, just want to say gets us up to 1920, and that's a year when two of the largest charitable organizations, on the German side, the Federated Jewish Charities, and on the Eastern European side, the United Hebrew Charities. That's when those two groups merged and became the Associated Jewish Charities, the beginnings of what we have today. So now that we've got to the beginnings, Beth, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Johns. I'm Beth Goldsmith, and I'm chair of the board of the Associated. I'm thrilled to be part of the Associated's 100th anniversary and part of our project to celebrate this milestone. The project, called A Century of Growth, Challenge, and Resilience, explores our 100 years of work in Baltimore's Jewish community, a community that has changed considerably over this time, but also retained its core values of sharing, caring, and faith. Through videos, including this one, as well as our website and a traveling exhibit, we're sharing our heritage. We are also aiming to honor those who came before us and in many ways made our own expansive work possible. Over the last year, as we've worked on this project, I've learned an immense amount about the history of the Associated and the incredible people who set up this organization and the impact they had. They made their life's work the work of charity to help others in need, and in doing so also made it possible for us in today's generation to continue and expand on their good works. Our current programs for older adults, our efforts for those with disabilities, our support of those fleeing persecution and anti-Semitism, our work with those who have suffered trauma and abuse, we can trace all of these efforts back to our earliest days of helping others here in Baltimore. And in the vein of early assistance, I'd like to share with you a few of the earliest campaigns that the brand new Associated Jewish Charities launched when it was founded 100 years ago. In 1920, our founders held a kickoff dinner at the Lyric Opera House, just across the street from our headquarters today, with an unbelievable goal of raising $500,000, which would be about $6.5 million today. That's a heck of a goal for a brand new group, and they made it. That first year, in 1920, our founders set a priority on education. They raised funds to improve teachers' skills and standardize their salaries. In 1924, our early members turned their attention to social services by launching a new campaign called You Give, They Live. Through this, they raised money for the various charities that the AJC supported, as well as to pay off a debt incurred in the organization's founding. And in 1928, in yet another new big campaign, our founders strove to broaden the fundraising bench by launching a program called You Never Said No. The goal here was to raise money from all strata of Jewish society. As the title suggests, the fundraisers from the very beginning were persistent. And so with a strong and lofty beginning, the Associated got its start a century ago. Although we may have changed the ways we raise funds a little today, emails and credit cards would have amazed the early Jewish fundraisers. The themes of the early campaigns, education, social services, and the democracy of giving, really have not changed at all. Johns, I'm going to turn things back over to you to wrap up this video, and I'm looking forward to joining you in the ones ahead.
Thanks so much, Beth. I'd like to wrap up with just one more thing, and that's one more merger to get us to the Associated that we have today. The Associated had been focused on domestic issues, and this is going to be a merger of the domestic and the international. In World War II, right from the beginning, it became clear that there was going to be a lot of need to help Jewish people in Germany and in Europe. And across the country, in cities across the country, folks banded together to raise funds. Here in Baltimore, we did that also. Our group was called the Jewish Welfare Fund. It raised money to fight anti-Semitism abroad, as well as to provide direct assistance for those in need. In 1950, after World War II was over, the two associations, the Jewish Welfare Fund and the Associated, were in the same office but separate groups. And they had the idea that in 1950 to try to raise funds together. In their words, unification of the two organizations will not only mean greater efficiency, it will also enable us to look at community problems as part of a total picture. So beginning in 1950, they started raising funds together, and eventually the two formally merged. And the organization they merged into is called the Associated Jewish Charities of Baltimore. So that gets us close to the name we have today, but it took until 1990 with a little fiddling, and in 1990, today's name emerged, and that is the Associated Jewish Federation of Baltimore. All right, on behalf of Beth and myself, I want to say thanks for joining us. We hope you join us for the next 4 videos. We're going to explore topics like immigration, the role of women, justice and equity issues, and we hope you'll tune in. Thanks so much, and we'll see you next time.